The sun was no longer a sphere but a jagged wound bleeding across the horizon, staining the Sierra Madre foothills in shades of bruised plum, burnt orange, and a deep, dusty crimson. It was the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the skin, but seemed to seek out the marrow, a dry, high desert chill that turned every breath into a fleeting ghost. Silas sat tall in the saddle of his buckskin, his body moving in a rhythmic, unconscious sympathy with the horse's steady gait. The only sounds in the vast cathedral of the canyon were the rhythmic creak of weathered leather, the soft clink of a bit, and the crunch of frozen grit beneath hooves. He was a man shaped by silence, his face a map of sun-faded lines and grit, eyes narrowed against the glare of 1,000 miles of trail. To Silas, the world was a simple place of geography and endurance, but tonight, the air felt heavy with something he couldn't quite put a name to, a sort of expectant hush that usually preceded a blizzard or a miracle. He was nearly past the junction, where the trail split, toward the Miller place when he felt a small, insistent tug on his stirrup leather. It was so light he might have mistaken it for a snag of greasewood. But his horse, a sensitive creature named Blue, huffed and came to a halt without a command. Silas looked down, shifting his weight, and for a moment, he thought the desert was playing tricks on his eyes. There, standing in the middle of the red dirt track, was Lily. She was the youngest of the Miller clan, a girl of maybe 6 or 7 who usually had more dirt on her face than a coal miner. Today, however, she looked uncharacteristically neat, though her heavy wool coat was buttoned crookedly, leaving a gap at her throat where a hand-knitted scarf hung limp. Her boots were caked in the pale clay of the wash, suggesting she'd walked a fair distance from the ranch house alone. Silas tipped the brim of his Stetson back, his gaze sweeping the empty horizon behind her to ensure she hadn't been chased by a coyote or a mountain lion. The scrub brush was still. The world was empty. He looked back down at her, and the sternness in his eyes softened just a fraction. He knew the Millers were struggling. He'd seen the lean cattle and the way the father, Thomas, looked at the sky with a desperate, praying sort of hunger for rain that never came. In a place where survival was a full-time occupation, Christmas was often just another day of breaking ice in the water troughs. "Silas," she whispered. Her voice was so thin it nearly vanished in the wind. She didn't look up at him with the usual mischievous glint he expected from a Miller. Instead, her eyes were wide, dark, and shimmering with a liquid sort of dread. Her breath bloomed in a sudden puff of white smoke, a tiny cloud that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "The sun's almost gone. Silas, it's Christmas Eve. The shadows are getting real long, and the trail is getting lost." Silas cleared his throat, the sound rough, like sandpaper on cedar. "That it is, little bit. Sun don't wait for no man, not even on a holiday. But you're a long way from the porch. Your mama's going to be frantic if she finds your bed empty." Lily didn't move. She didn't seem to care about the cold or the scolding that surely awaited her. She reached out and rested a small, reddened hand on Blue's shoulder, the horse lowering his head to snuff at her hair. She looked out toward the north, where the mountains turned into a wall of impenetrable black glass. Beyond those peaks lay 1,000 miles of nothing, no towns, no lights, no signposts. For a child growing up in the isolation of the high ranch, the world was a terrifyingly large place, and the maps they drew in school seemed like fairy tales compared to the harsh reality of the scrub. "Papa says the mail rider got lost last week," she said, her voice trembling just enough to make Silas's heart tighten in a way he wasn't used to. "He said the wind blew the landmarks away and the snow covered the tracks. He said that's why we haven't had a letter from Grandma in a month. He says our ranch is just a speck of dust on a giant brown blanket." She paused, her lower lip quivering as she turned her gaze back to the cowboy. The question she had been carrying all the way from the house finally broke free. "Is Santa late because he can't find our ranch? Is he out there spinning circles because we're too far hidden in the rocks?" The weight of the question hung in the air, heavier than the winter gear Silas carried. He saw the logic of a ranch child in her eyes, a logic built on the harsh truths of the frontier. Out here, if you weren't found, you disappeared. If the supply wagon didn't see your smoke, you went hungry. To her, Santa Claus wasn't a magical entity that defied the laws of physics. He was a traveler, a teamster of sorts, subject to the same navigational hazards that plagued every rider in the territory. She wasn't worried about being naughty or nice, and she'd been a good girl, helping with the chickens and the woodpile. Her fear was much more practical and much more devastating. She was afraid of being invisible. She feared that they were so small and so remote that even a miracle would pass them by in the dark. Silas looked at her, and for a second, he saw himself, not as the hardened drifter he was, but as a boy who had once waited for things that never arrived. He looked at the Miller Ranch in the distance, a lonely cluster of timber and stone clinging to the side of a canyon like a barnacle on a ship. There were no festive lights, no decorations, only a single, flickering amber glow from a kerosene lamp in the window. From this height, it did look like a speck of dust. It looked like a place that could easily be missed by someone flying high above the clouds, distracted by the bright, easy targets of the valley towns. He felt the cold deepening, the temperature dropping 10 degrees the moment the sun's rim vanished. The first star of the evening, sharp and cold as a diamond, pricked through the purple sky. He realized he couldn't just tell her a lie, because ranch kids knew the smell of a lie better than most. He had to give her a reason to believe that the geography of the heart was different from the geography of the trail. He shifted in his saddle, the leather protesting, and prepared to speak the most important words he'd uttered in a decade. He needed to be more than a lone cowboy on a dark road. He needed to be the one who mapped the way home. Silas looked down at the small, shivering figure of Lily Miller, and for the first time in his life, the vast, unforgiving silence of the high desert felt like an enemy he had to defeat. He was a man who lived by the code of the trail, a man who spoke in grunts and nods, but he looked at her watering eyes and realized that the truth, the hard, dusty truth of the ranch, wasn't enough tonight. He shifted his weight, the heavy sheepskin of his coat rustling, and made a decision. He didn't just want to comfort her. He wanted to give her a map of a world where she was seen. With a grunt of effort, he swung his right leg over the cantle and slid down from blue. His boots hit the frozen ground with a solid, echoing thud, and the familiar jingle of his spurs cut through the thin mountain air like a bell. He dropped to one knee, a movement that made his old joints protest, but he ignored the ache. Up close, he could see the tiny cracks in Lily's skin from the dry wind and the way she was twisting a loose thread on her sleeve into a tight, nervous knot. He was now eye level with her, and the change in perspective seemed to startle her out of her gloom. He reached out with a gloved hand, gently steadying her by the shoulder. Her coat was thin, far too thin for a night that promised a hard frost, and that realization sharpened his resolve. He couldn't give her a fire, but he could give her a story that burned just as bright. "Now you listen to me, little bit," Silas began, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that commanded attention. "I've spent 20 years navigating these canyons. I've seen men get lost in their own backyards when the fog rolls in, and I've seen the mail rider miss the turnoff, more times than I can count on my fingers. You're right to worry about a paper map. A paper map is just ink and lies out here. The wind changes the dunes and the snow hides the landmarks. If that's all Santa had, he'd be wandering around the Rio Grande until Easter." Lily's eyes grew even wider, a flash of terror crossing her face before he held up a finger to stop her. "But," he said, emphasizing the word until it hung in the air between them, "Santa don't use the tools of men. He doesn't look down at the ground to find his way. He looks at things that don't ever move, no matter how hard the wind blows." He gestured with a broad, calloused hand toward the horizon. The sky was now a deep, velvety indigo, and the stars were beginning to burn through the haze with a cold, piercing intensity. He pointed toward Three Fingers Mountain, its triple peak silhouetted against the sky like a giant's hand reaching for the heavens. The snow on the highest ridges caught the very last of the refracted light, glowing with an ethereal, ghostly silver. "You see that peak?" Silas asked. Lily nodded vigorously, her chin tucked into her scarf. "That's the high country compass. It's the tallest thing between here and the Arctic Circle. To you and me, it's just a mountain. But to a man flying a sleigh, that's a lighthouse. It's got a specific shine to it, a silver glow that tells him exactly where he is in the world." He sights his line off that middle finger, and it leads him straight down the spine of this valley. He felt her tension ease just a fraction, the grip on her sleeve loosening. But he knew he needed more. He needed to bridge the gap between the distant mountain and the humble, sagging porch of the Miller Ranch. He leaned in a little closer, his breath mingling with hers in a single cloud of white. "And then there's your papa," Silas continued, a ghost of a smile touching his weathered lips. "I rode past your place an hour ago. I saw the smoke coming out of that rock chimney of yours." "Your papa's been burning cedar and seasoned oak all day, hasn't he?" Lily nodded. He was chopping wood since before the sun was up. He said we needed a big fire to keep the frost out of the kitchen. Well, that's where he's smarter than he lets on, Silas said with a conspiratorial wink. To us, that just smells like a good fire. But to a team of reindeer? Reindeer have noses that can smell a lichen patch under 3 feet of snow from 10 miles away. That cedar smoke from the Miller Ranch? Out here in the clean, cold air that smells like a homing beacon. It's like a sweet, spicy trail of breadcrumbs leading right to your roof. He could find your ranch in a blindfold just by following the scent of that cedar. He reached back toward his saddle, fumbling with the leather ties of his saddlebag. He pulled out a small, gnarled sprig of sagebrush. It was a common thing, something he'd plucked earlier in the day to clean the grit from a buckle, but he looked at it now as if it were a holy relic. He pulled a piece of frayed red twine from his pocket, a bit of string he'd saved, from a grain sack, and tied it carefully around the silver-gray leaves. Now this here is the final piece of the puzzle, Silas said, pressing the sprig into Lily's small, cold palm. Her fingers closed around it automatically. This is high country sage. It's lived through the droughts and the freezes, and it knows the layout of this dirt better than anyone. I want you to take this back and hang it on the front gate. Not the porch, mind you, but the gate. It acts like a signal fire for the spirit. It tells the wind to lay down in the shadows, to move aside so the runners of that sleigh can find the flat ground near the barn. Lily looked down at the sagebrush, her expression shifting from doubt to a sudden radiant hope. The idea that her home wasn't just a speck of dust, but a place marked by mountains, scented by cedar, and guarded by a cowboy's charm seemed to take root in her. The fear that had made her look so small against the desert floor vanished, replaced by a sense of urgent purpose. She wasn't just a girl waiting to be found anymore. She was a navigator, a vital part of the journey. He really won't miss us? She asked, one last lingering bit of hesitation in her voice. Silas stood up, his tall frame blocking the biting wind and casting a protective shadow over her. He adjusted his hat, pulling the brim down low. Little bit, with that mountain guiding him, that smoke calling to him, and you hanging that sage on the gate. He couldn't miss the Miller Ranch if he tried. He's probably crossing the border right now, checking his watch and wondering why he didn't start the cedar fires earlier. Lily let out a joyous, high-pitched laugh that seemed to ring against the canyon walls. I have to go. I have to get it on the gate before the moon gets any higher. She turned and began to run, her small boots kicking up puffs of red dust that glowed in the starlight. She didn't look back, her mind already on the gate and the chimney and the magical mechanics of a Christmas Eve in the wild. Silas watched her until she was nothing more than a moving shadow against the pale glow of the ranch house lights. He climbed back into his saddle, his muscles stiff but his heart feeling strangely light, as if he'd shed a layer of the grit he'd been carrying for years. He looked up at the sky, at the cold, indifferent stars and the silent peaks of the Sierra Madres. He knew the Millers wouldn't have much under the tree, maybe an orange, maybe a hand-carved toy if Thomas had found the time. But they would have the one thing the desert usually tried to take away, the certainty that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. You heard the lady, Silas whispered into the freezing dark, his breath a final prayer in the night. Keep the stars bright. Don't you dare let her down. He turned blue away from the ranch, heading toward his own lonely line camp, a man once again in the silence but no longer alone.